I've had a fair number of friends who were somewhere between atheist and agnostic, usually not militant and hostile to the faith systems of the world, but sometimes. And a very popular soundbite that I've heard repeated a lot, I think it comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson, or it might be Bill Nye, but it's that science doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. It just is. And that's not really true if you get to thinking about it, because science needs funding. Science needs resources. Science needs for people to decide to become scientists. I mean, the universe and its condition, quite apart from the interpretations of the human observer, is out there and will do what it does. But the idea that belief is irrelevant to science is very naive about the way what we qualify, what we accept and certify is the word I wanted. What we certify as science really is dependent on a lot of people acting out and renewing their agreements and operating out of trust in one another. Over the weekend, I listened to an episode of Radiolab, their most recent one, that was fairly fascinating. It started off being about how a woman made a decision to become a bone marrow donor, how she registered to become a bone marrow donor, and they found her match, and the match was a performer, a Christian magician. And he found so many details in how the story had unfolded that matched the gospel perfectly, that he was using actually what had happened to him as part of his presentation to the audience as he drew in. And he invited her to come and be at those shows, because the big reveal was he would say, "And my donor is here tonight," and the crowd would just go absolutely wild. Well, if they're going to make a Radiolab episode about it, there's going to be an interesting twist, and the interesting twist is she is not a follower of Christ at all. And she said a few times what I have heard people say: "I wish I could believe it. I wish I could believe it." And very often that's accompanied by, "It may be true for you, it's wonderful for you, but it's just not for me. I can't believe it." And so when I take those two instances of the word belief, "I wish I could believe it, it's true for you, but not for me," and then the idea, science doesn't care whether you believe in it or not, I think what's happening there is the fallacy of equivocation. That true and belief, the precise contextualized shade of meaning, is getting lost a little bit. In the first place, I years ago got very uncomfortable with this notion that people choose a faith, and that they choose a faith because it fits them. And it just baffles me that so many people don't notice the fact that just about all the major belief systems in the world make really totalizing claims about the universe, like where it came from. And all those claims are mutually exclusive. I mean, the Christian faith teaches that God created the universe and it did not come about any other way. So, if what the Bible teaches is correct, then the Hindu account of the beginning of reality is incorrect. These are totalizing and exclusive claims. Now, that is the reason some people give for why Christianity doesn't fit them. But in an illustration I've used before, that's thinking about it completely the wrong way. Gravity makes people fall down and break bones. That's a very, very uncomfortable, sometimes sad, sometimes heartbreaking part of a story. But it is wildly irrational to say, well, because gravity causes so much physical suffering and then also so much emotional suffering when I see what happened when buildings collapsed and people were buried alive, I just can't bring myself to believe in gravity. It's for you, but it's not for me. It just unleashes too much pain in the world. Well, where did you ever get the idea that you were given the option? Now, the difference here is what God has built into the universe is that the limits that biblical teaching place on people's lives are not as immediately perceptible, not as unmistakable, not as impossible to ignore as the physical machinery of the universe, such as gravity. So there is an opening, there is space to turn a blind eye to the consequences of a choice to reject God. And what I got to thinking about this morning is how many other choices we make that fit that exact trajectory. And here I am thinking about addiction again, honestly, because this morning on the radio, I was listening to the BBC before National Public Radio came on the air, and they told a story about a father who tried to help his daughter conquer heroin addiction, and the story does not have a happy ending, but in her memory, he is still trying to help other people who are battling addiction to heroin, and he's built a halfway house and named it for her. And there again, there are choices you can make where the actual physical consequences, the physical limits that they place on you, you don't get instant feedback. And so what do people do in response? In response, they rationalize and they deny and they go for the immediate gratification. And even when there is a ton of information out there that makes it very, very clear the consequences of what they're doing, they make their choice anyway. And there are jokes, there are communities that grow up around substance abuse and about rejecting the messages that are warnings. There are people who lean right into their substance habit and don't make any effort to try to get off it. And then there are others who've surrendered to their substance habit. They may know that it's hurting them very much, but they don't really commit, or maybe they think that it's impossible for them to reach the point where they can be free of their addiction. And I'm not the first person ever to characterize declining the gospel, distancing yourself from God, as being parallel to addiction. That's the idea behind Celebrate Recovery, that the sin nature, what the Bible says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that is actually an addiction, that we are in denial about it, that we haven't hit bottom. But one of the things we can do is we can turn the gospel, we can turn the Beatitudes specifically, we can weave together the Beatitudes and the 12 steps of recovery, and that's a way that we can actually put our full attention on what the Bible teaches us about the choices that we ought to be making. So that idea, the comparing those two, is not at all original with me. I got to thinking this morning on my walk into work about pro-ana, which I believe I've used this as an illustration in this podcast before, and I haven't heard about it in a few years, but I remember it being explained to me many, many years ago that eating disorders very commonly, maybe not universally, but very commonly showed up in people who felt like they did not have control in any other area in their life. But the one thing that they could control was how much they ate, or at the very least they could control how much they actually digested. So they could limit what they eat, and they could be anorexic, they could binge and purge and be bulimic, they could abuse laxatives, they could do too much exercise. It reminds me, I have a student that I'm working with in my argumentation class, and he and I are doing an honors contract on visual argument, and one of the things we looked at was a case study of prison tattoos. And one of the visual arguments that prisoners make with their tattoos is that the warden does not control everything. The warden's rules may be able to control almost everything I do, but this body, it is still my body. And in some ways, I guess you could think of anorexia as making, or eating disorders under this understanding, as making a similar argument. And so, a number of years ago, I remember reading up on how there were whole communities that had formed around this idea, this is how we take control. And they would say that these, what we call eating disorders, were actually a choice. And if people wanted to make that choice, they should have the freedom. We should respect that choice. We should not medicalize it, and we should not forcibly commit people, even if our judgment was that they were endangering their lives. We should not forcibly institutionalize them for medical intervention that got between them and the choice they wanted to make. And so that I tie back together with the idea that there are limits, perceptible limits, between our choices and the consequences that will ultimately land on us, and we can, with our interpretations, blind ourselves. Things like gravity, things like math, 2 plus 2 is 4. Nobody ever tries to say, well, 2 plus 2 may be 4 for you, but not for me, because if you have 2 fingers, then you have 2 more fingers, well, there you go. The idea that you need to continue breathing, and if you stop breathing for more than a minute or two, or for more than a few minutes, I suppose, then you're going to die. That's the kind of thing where people can immediately see the consequences and properly interpret it, and there really is no escape from the meaning of that. The classic one-line narrative about drug use back when I was a kid, I haven't heard it in a few years, was the hippie on the acid trip who believed he could fly. And because he took a powerful hallucinogen, he didn't even understand gravity anymore. And so, this woman who kept saying in this podcast, well, it may be true for you, but not for me. I wish I could believe you, but I just can't. In that, I hear echoes of, I wish I could stop abusing this substance, but I just can't. And so therefore, I've stopped trying. And yet people are destroying themselves, and some people are downright militant about it, and some people lean into their substance addiction, and some people are militant atheists. And all of this, I think, comes back to my understanding of the hollowing out of connective tissue, because it seems as though there have been chapters in our recent history where a lot of the institutions and a lot of the ideas that we use to get through each day, there was a certain level of trust. There was a certain level of consensus. But today, and once again I'll drop the example of people who are anti-vaccines and think the vaccines cause autism, so many of those institutions, there is a narrative that says don't trust them, you shouldn't trust them. They create an appearance, but it's a deceptive appearance. And when I want to say your disbelief is irrational, this narrative says, well, but what you're asking me to believe in is only a veneer that's been put up by people who are manipulating me. And that belief is so pervasive. And there are people who have found that they can be powerful and they can earn money by inflaming that belief. And because they're getting the quick, instant gratification of that money and that power, they aren't getting the feedback of the consequences of the forces that they're setting in motion. And in part, this is what's going on, I think, with the Republican Party. And in part, this is what's going on with a lot of commentators who specialize in these messages of paranoia and these messages of not trusting, being quick to write people off as enemies and to unite only with your own kind, with your own tribe. And the more we keep repeating that pattern, and the more we are too afraid to trust, we find the moment of trusting aversive, the more we find that connective tissue that used to make it easy, not easy, but doable to get through typical life challenges, those life challenges become harder and harder to navigate, which then fuels the impulse to not trust anybody and to continue to find trusting very aversive. So what do you do about that? Well, one of my first instincts back in November of last year, right after the election happened, was to say, well, now it's more important than ever that we teach critical thinking, that we teach to students who are coming up, these are the tools, these are the things to watch for that tell you that you are being manipulated. And these are the ways that you tell fake news and junk science from something that's trustworthy. These are the kinds of red flags that should make you frown and say, that doesn't sound right. I want to double check that. Which it seems as though we let a big chunk of the current cohort get through their education not really having been prepared for that. And that, of course, gets me to wondering if maybe high-stakes testing and a whole wave of education reform had something to do with that, and the way public education became very mechanical, very industrial, almost like a factory, and there were fewer and fewer opportunities along the way in education for people to ask difficult questions that stepped out of a script. I wonder if that didn't contribute to it. But the analogy I got to here, because another thing that people get addicted to is spending money, the analogy I got to here was what we really ought to be doing with our children, particularly our preteens and teens, is we ought to be teaching them financial literacy. And financial literacy is about how to step out of that moment of instant gratification and also how to spot when something is a scam. And both of those, if students are equipped with that from the beginning, then they can be spared. They can defend themselves against so many experiences, so many bad choices that will put them on a path where the bad choices just magnify themselves, where they accumulate and they weigh them down like baggage. And what do you do today with people who have completely messed up their financial situation? They are deeply in debt. They have no retirement savings. Well, what you do is you try counseling, financial counseling. You try to look at where they are and help them untangle the mess, change the habits that got them there so they don't do additional damage, and then with the resources available to them and the time they have left, what can they do to try to get on a more sound footing? And so I guess what I'm thinking this morning is I wonder, what analog is there to that in people's consumption of information? And is there such a thing as cognitive counseling? And if you're into a cognitive debt, if you're into a debt as far as what you understand about the world, is there a way to do what's done in financial counseling, get you unentangled from those bad habits, and let you, with whatever position you've got, the resources available, and the time you have left, get you to consume information in a way that it helps you and it doesn't sabotage you as much? And definitely, as preteens and teens are to the point where they're about to enter the adult world, what we've got to find better ways to do is to make people critical consumers of information and critical consumers of messages, people who have a very ready skepticism response, but also can be very, very skillful at separating what's reliable from what's not reliable. And I don't mean that if two people disagree and each side has a reasoned position that one is reliable and the other is not reliable, but where people have found that manipulation using messages that they know are not reliable is a shortcut to becoming powerful and wealthy, can we teach the customers to say no to that? And I don't know, maybe not.